Hello, this is El Spectral. Welcome back to the Land of Empires. And today I want to give my first impressions of the 6 new Season 1 hero that were recently released in the game. Starting out with Apollo, who is an archer. Now, to briefly take a look at the stats, the basic stats of these Season 1 heroes, I see that they are relatively comparable to the Season 1 heroes that we currently have, which include Cleopatra, it includes Valkyrie, and it includes Hyeokgeose, meaning that stat-wise, these heroes appear to be comparable to Season 1 heroes. Now, let's take a look at their skills. The rage skill for this hero is that it deals 400% to the target enemy troops and increase the damage of your troops' normal attack by 20%, stackable infinitely with a 15-second cooldown. I think this skill is relatively good in the context of Season 1. The 400% damage is respectable. It is similar to Cleopatra. It is respectable within Season 1, but rather not impactful at later seasons. So the main focus of this skill is the 20%. The troops with the apostrophe here, it suggests that it only applies to the archers. Otherwise, it would say all troop types normal attack. So I think 20% is impactful, but considering the behavior of Season 1 combat, it really doesn't last too long. It lasts maybe 30 seconds, maximum 45 seconds. So you wouldn't be expecting to get more than 1 to 2 stacks from this skill. And considering Season 1 combat or later season combat is a mix of rage skill as well as normal skill attack damage, it kind of dilutes the overall impact of this skill. So while I think this skill is very good for Season 1, I wouldn't think it is very good beyond, say, Season 2 or 3. Now his next skill is to reduce your troops' rage skill charge speed by 10%, but increase their normal attack damage by 30%. So it appears that this hero is very much based on normal attack damage. I would say that decreasing the rage skill charge speed by 10% is actually fairly bad. It is recoverable in a rally situation where you have, for example, a rally support that boosts the rage skill charge speed. Otherwise, this skill essentially says that your archer will hit later than their archer. And this is an issue because there are skills that the cavalry can use. For example, Morgan. When Morgan uses his skill actually reduces the archer's final ferocity by 60%, meaning that your archer suddenly deals next to no damage. So if your opponent casts their rage skill before your archer can be nerfed before they are able to really use their rage skill, which further reduces the utility of this skill due to the reduced rage skill charge speed. But increasing the normal attack damage by 30%, this skill is quite good, especially as it lasts through the entire fight. The final passive, passive number 2 I should say, is to increase the archer ferocity by 20% and archer HP by 20%. Now my opinion on this skill is that it is fairly useless because according to the language, it is a direct additive addition of the stats to your basic stats. And this means that if you have 1000% ferocity, for example, it increases that to 1020%, which, as you can see, really doesn't do much. So in terms of Season 1 skill power, I would say this is comparable to the Season 1 skills of other heroes, maybe a little better than Cleopatra. And this skill is, I would say, quite decent, but really still only decent within the realms of Season 1 to Season 2. I wouldn't even say Season 3 because Hanzo is a very powerful archer. Now we look at his awakening skill, and what it does is that it increases your troops' normal attack damage by 10%. Now, of course, testing would give us the final results, but based on the language in the description here, I think that this skill also only applies to the archer. So it increased the archer's normal attack by 10%. Out of Season 1 hero awakening passives, I think this is quite good. Out of Season 2, I think it is comparable, but beyond Season 2, I think it is just average. So overall, I would rate this hero as Season 1.5. I wouldn't even, he might be as good as Anubis, but I wouldn't rate him beyond that. Moving on to the next hero, who is Guan Yu. His stats actually look alright, but still within the realm of season 1 to season 2. Looking at his rage skill, it increases your cavalry defense by 10% and cavalry attack by 50% for 3 seconds, then deals 700% damage to the target troops. Of course, it depends on who this cavalry actually targets. If this cavalry targets the opposing cavalry, then it could be quite impactful, because 700% damage to the opposing cavalry will pretty much kill the opposing cavalry. But if he is targeting the opposing infantry, then it is just a fairly average damage value. Now, increasing cavalry defense by 10% and cavalry attack by 50% for 3 seconds, once again, based on the language, it appears to be a simple addition of stats, meaning that these are not very impactful, especially if you have high stats. Now, in season 1, where stats are relatively low, this would see a lot of impact, but that only suggests that this hero is built for season 1 and 2 and not beyond that. Now, moving on to passive skill number 1, it increases your troops' rage skill damage by 40%. Now, this is the first relatively impactful skill I see, and it is a skill that is more geared towards season 3, so it is not something you would typically observe in season 1 and 2. So I would rate this skill fairly high, and I would call it a season 3 skill. However, due to the nature of cavalries, you don't really want to use many cavalries in season 1 through even season 5. So the ultimate impact of this skill might end up being quite limited. The last skill is to increase your cavalry ferocity by 35%. This is an additive increase, and therefore I don't really value this skill very much. If you look at this hero, for example, Anher, he has this skill that increases all units' HP by 45%. Now, at face value, this actually sounds quite good, but because it is an additive bonus, practically it does pretty much nothing. So I would rate Guan Yu overall as a fairly decent cavalry hero, but because of how lackluster cavalry heroes are in season 1 through 3, I wouldn't really say that he will bring you much in terms of utility. Moving on to the next hero, who is an infantry hero. Looking at the stats, once again, it is very similar to the other heroes under this category. And the rage skill deals 550% damage to the enemy troops and reduces their defense by 15% for 6 seconds. Now, this appears to be an additive reduction because there is no overall or final term in this description, and that is what really I'm looking for. If we go to some of the more powerful later season heroes, you would notice that every description related to stats, it typically has final or overall added to them, especially final. Let's see if I can find something. So here we can see Kellerman's second passive adds 20% of all stats, of all final stats, to his final stats. To his stat percentage. And what I suspect this does is that it is a 1.2 multiplier to the percentage of your stats. So instead of an additive, you have a multiplicative factor. So for example, if you have 1000%, each of these are 200% additions. And that is really much more impactful than a straight up 20% addition. And this is why I don't think this skill is very impactful. The damage is pretty decent for season 1-2, but nothing special after that. Now moving on to passive number 1, it increases the damage of your troops by 15% and reduces their damage taken by 40%. Now this passive is actually quite interesting, especially the damage reduction. 40% is quite good, especially if it is always up across the duration of the battle. I would say this skill is comparable to what I would expect in a season 3 passive skill. So this passive skill is really quite good for season 1. And finally, her passive number 2 increases infantry ferocity by 60% and infantry HP by 15%. The numbers are fairly good, but since it is additive, I only expect it to be impactful in season 1 and 2. And finally, the awakening skill, it increases the the infantry troops rage skill damage by 10%, but because in season 1 through 5, infantry doesn't really do all that much rage skill damage, this passive is relatively useless. So overall, I would rate this hero's skills on par with Caesar. I believe this hero has slightly worse stats than Caesar if we were to take a look at this hero and take a look at his stats. 248%. So comparing to 248%, 230% is about 18% lower. And if we just take a look at his skills, and reduces their damage dealt by 70% for 9 seconds. And this is a big reduction. And you can see based on this skill why Caesar is so powerful in Season 1 and even Season 2. And his first passes is during the first 15 seconds after the battle starts, all your troops' skill damage increased by 30% and rage skill damage taken decreases by 30%. So you can see that all of these effects are multiplicative instead of additive, and that's what makes Caesar strong. And finally, Caesar's third skill, it reduces damage taken by your infantry troops by 40% and damage from rage skill taken by cavalry troops by 50%. Now, I don't actually remember these descriptions being the case back when I ran Caesar. I suspect they might have buffed Caesar. But anyways, after refreshing my memory on Caesar's skill, I would actually rate this infantry hero, a lower tier than Caesar. I would put this infantry hero at about season 1.5 in terms of power. Relatively similar to Athena. So actually, I would rate this hero at season 2 in terms of skill power. Because compared to Caesar, Athena is quite a bit inferior. Finally, moving on to Europa. I won't be checking the stats now because they're all probably relatively comparable. So we'll dive straight into the rage skill. And the description of this rage skill is that all allied troops' damage taken is reduced by 20%. Damage dealt increased by 30%, lasts for 9 seconds. So it doesn't appear that this skill does any damage. It is more of a buffing skill. Now 20% is a decent amount and 30% is also a decent amount. So this is actually quite good for cavalry, but the cavalry typically does not survive very long. So if this was a passive skill, I would actually rate this skill very highly because even after the cavalry dies, the skill's effect can be maintained across the entire duration of the fight. But because the cavalry will die relatively quickly, I do not expect a very good effect of this skill. I would say this skill's effect, if it wasn't for the fact that it doesn't last once the cavalry dies, I would say this is comparable to a season 2 to season 3 effect. Her passive number 1 is to reduce all enemy troops' normal attack damage by 15%. Now this straight up reduction is quite good, especially on cavalry, and this is what I was talking about. Because it is a passive skill, even after Europa dies, this skill will still take effect. Now, actually in terms of the power of this skill, I'll rate it between season 2 and season 3, mostly because Lancelot is quite bad. He doesn't have any skills that can be compared to this skill. But because the season 3 setup is quite good, you can kind of choose between Hannibal and this hero. I think these two are interchangeable, although it still does depend on the next two skills. I'll have to take a look at them. So the third skill is increase all allied troops defense by 20%. But due to the language, once again, this is most likely an additive buff, and so it is not very impactful. The Awakening skill increases the damage of all allied troops' normal attack by 7%. So it appears that this hero has pretty good synergy with Apollo, but because unfortunately we have Hattori Hanzo, who is an extremely powerful Season 3 archer, an extremely powerful archer overall, he's just falling under Season 3. Unfortunately, I would not put Apollo with Europa. I would rather use Hanzo with Europa. But this skill overall is quite good. It increases normal attack damage, and Season 3 is quite known for its normal attack damage. Moving on to this hero, I won't make an effort to pronounce the name, but the Rage skill is to deal 600% damage to the target enemy troops, increasing their skill damage taken by 30% for 12 seconds, with a 15-second cooldown. Now this actually looks like a very decent skill for the archer, especially in season 1. In season 1, this archer would be very, very dominant, although it depends on who exactly it targets. If it targets infantry, then this skill is already very good. If it targets both infantry and cavalry, then this skill is awesome for season 1 through 2. Unfortunately, compared to Hanzo, it is still very much up for grabs, because let's just spend 10 seconds to look at Hanzo's rage skill, incredible rage skill. Cast a burning flame to the target, reducing their damage dealt by 30% and inflicting 600% damage every 1.5 seconds for 6 seconds. So this skill multiplies this percent by 4, meaning that Hanzo deals 2,400% damage to the opponent whenever he uses his rage skill. And that is essentially why Hanzo is so much more powerful than all the archers around him. So 600% really cannot hold a candle to 2,400%. And that is why I think, although this hero is very good for season 1 and 2, he will fall behind by season 3. Of course, in Legends Arena and Apex Arena, you will need 3 teams. So this hero will be very good for a while. His passive number 1 is to increase your troops' rage skill charge speed by 40%. So I think this only affects the archer, but is a very good skill. I would say this skill is very good, especially since there are no skills that affect charge speed in season 1 through 3. Now some of you might think, why not stack skills that buffs charge speed? For example, why not stack this hero with Morgan? You would instantly get 35 plus 40% charge speed equals 75% charge speed, and you would actually get 35% charge bar back after using the rage skill. That is Morgan's skill effect. However, what we've learned through testing is that these heroes cannot use their rage skill repeatedly like that. It does not exactly correlate with the speed of their rage skill charge. There does seem to be a cap on the speed at which these heroes can use their rage skill. So any charge speed beyond 50% actually does not really seem to have much of an effect. So although combining heroes that has the charge speed buff as a passive sounds like a good idea on paper, it might not have any practical utility because it might not just work. It might simply just not work. His second passive, is to improve your archer attack by 30%. So this is an additive stat, so it will likely not be very impactful. And his rage skill is that it increases your troops' rage skill damage by 10%. I think this is a pretty good rage skill. So overall, I would say this hero is comparable to Anubis. Because he has this skill, I would go as far as to say he is better than Anubis. So I would put him between season 2 and season 3 in terms of an archer hero. And finally, we have Saladin. His rage skill is to deal 300% damage to the enemy troops and reduce their soldiers' HP by 20%, stackable with no cap with a 15-second cooldown. Although a reduction with no cap sounds good, I think the problem that will happen is that fights simply will not last long enough to take advantage of these multiple debuff stacks. So for example, even if the fight lasts to 1 minute, you will reduce the opponent HP by 100%. And if the opponent has 500% HP, which is a typically normal stat for season 2, then you will turn 500% into 400%, and all that will do is allow your troops to deal like 20% more damage to that opponent infantry. So that is really not impactful. So I think this skill is fairly mediocre. His passive number 1, it decreases your troops' rage skill damage by 10%, but increases their normal attack damage by 25%. Now, I think this skill is quite bad, especially if we were to compare to like a skill that does not have any downsides and simply increases the damage of your skills. Like increases, this also has a downside. So neither skills are very good. And I believe these skills also only affect infantry. So overall, I would say this skill is fairly mediocre. And finally, increases your infantry HP by 20%. This skill is even worse than Anhurst's skill, who is a purple hero. Unless so the only way this skill can be good is if they messed up in their description and actually coded this effect to be a multiplier instead of an addition. So that is the only way this skill can be good. If this description is accurate, then this skill is pretty all but negligible, I would say. And finally, his awakening skill is to increase your troops' normal attack damage by 10%. This is good, and it partially offset the effect of this skill. But I don't think this skill is very useful. I would rate this hero between Season 1 and Season 2, but I'm not even sure whether this hero will be better than Athena, who has some very mediocre skills, but still has some useful effects. For example, here, all allied troops damage taken reduced by 40% for 6 seconds. This effect is, I would say, half decent, but not comparable to Caesar. This skill is mediocre, and this skill is very mediocre. And this skill buffs the rage skill, which is good because the rage skill is her strongest skill. So Athena, because of how mediocre Athena is, I would say these two heroes are a little bit comparable. But if you give me a choice between Athena and Saladin, I would probably run Athena, especially considering she will also have better stats. Now, to give a comparison and why players who are already past Season 3 really should not be worried or should be concerned with getting these heroes, is let's just look at some of these later hero skills. So let's take a look at this Season 6 hero. So this is the meta of Season 6. She is currently one of the best heroes in the game, the best infantry in the game. And her rage skill deals 1000 damage to all enemy troops and reduces their damage by 90% for 6 seconds. So just think about that for a second. It reduces your opponent's entire damage to pretty much negligible for 6 seconds after she uses her rage skill. And this rage skill does 1000 damage, which is an incredible number, especially paired with the Season 6 archer, who really buffs. It makes the infantry cracked pretty much. It boosts their damage by like 3.5 fold. And that's really crazy. And take a look at this skill. It increases your unit's final HP by 200% and reduces their skill damage taken by 85%. So these are two multipliers next to each other. You multiply your HP percent by 3, and then you decrease the damage taken by 0.85. And that's just an absolutely insane skill. And her third skill, in battle, enemy archer and cavalry units takes 300% damage every 3 seconds until the end of battle. Now this might not sound like much, but due to her ability, she is able to bypass the infantry and directly damage the archer and cavalry, who will take much higher damage than the infantry. Like, if you think about Season 1 through 5 combat, the role of the infantry is not to deal damage, but rather protect your cavalry and archer. She can bypass that and deals 300% damage every 3 seconds, which is almost like a normal attack. Like, normal attacks are about every 1.5 to 2 seconds. So these are essentially dealing 3 normal attacks every under the span of two, like what you would expect, like 2 normal attacks pretty much. So this hits even harder than if Frost was normal hitting your cavalry and archer directly. And this is a very devastating skill for the back line, especially with the archer buff. Just take a look at this buff. This buff increases your melee troops' final ferocity by 50% every 5 seconds up to 5 stacks. And because it is a passive skill, it doesn't even matter if the archer dies. If the archer dies 1 second after a battle starts, the infantry will still get 250% final ferocity. And that, as I mentioned earlier, might be equivalent to a 3.5 multiplier in stats. And let's say you have 1000% ferocity stats, you end up with 3500% ferocity stats. Now compare that 2,500% stat boost to these, 20%, 10%, and you realize why these heroes really don't matter after season 3. So my overall impression of these heroes is that they are very good for season 1. They are decent for season 2, but by season 3, they will mostly fall behind. Of course, they look quite good, and get them if you like how they look, if you like how they play, and if you like dominating in season 1 and 2. I hope everyone liked this video and learned something in it, and I will see everyone in the next video.